Hello. All right. How's everyone? I'm doing well. I just had a nice break, and oh wow. By nice break I mean I did not film on Monday because I was on deadline. Tuesday I was on deadline. And then for the rest of the week I took my break. I decided I was going to just relax, maybe plot my next book. And sure enough, I plotted the entire next book. So, yeah. I think I plotted book 4 of the series in 2 days, which was a big shot. And by plot, I mean I used Sarah Cannon's Plot Your Novel pages, and I filled that out in 2 days. And then yesterday I went through and I plotted out what was going to happen for the first 10,000 words ish, and put all my plot points in the correct spot. And by correct spot, I just mean generally where they need to go. And then today I wrote I finished plotting the first 10,000 words today, about 5:30 to 8 o'clock, 8:45. That's what I was doing this morning. And let's see, 9 to 10 this morning, I wrote for an hour, complete, 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock. And I got 600 and something. Just a second, I wrote it down. 656 words in that 1 hour. And then I got laundry started and waited until about 11, and then I started writing again. I wrote from 11 to 12. Kind of. I got about 345 words. Yeah, 345 words in that 1 hour. And that was because I had distractions. I had to fix the Roomba because it got stuck twice. And I had to talk with my mom, who was on her lunch break. So I have 1,084 words in the document right now. I'm writing in Scrivener this time instead of in Google Docs. But it's fun. I'm trying to get a 10,000 word day, but I don't know. It's like 1:04 my time. So we'll see. We are going to continue reading Rebel. We only have today, Wednesday, and Friday left of this book. And I am excited. All right, so we left off where Frederick is going through an ordeal before his coronation. I will find a way to get my mouth to work. So he had his ordeal before his coronation, and now it is the next day. And let's get started. I'm going to post a link in the comments so that you can read my book as we go, if you want. All right. Oh, pardon me. All right, let's get started. The coronation and finalizing the contract. The ceremony was extravagant. The hall was decorated in lots of red and black silk, and there were lots of roses around the room. The black silk was for the mourning period, but the roses symbolized the love that Julius held for his wife. Caterina watched as her brother walked down the aisle to where the Pope stood with a crown and scepter. Her brother stood proudly as Natalia smiled at him from her seat. The Pope asked, "Do you swear to protect and serve your country for as long as you rule?" "I swear," Frederick replied. His expression showed his honesty and his seriousness. Caterina thought back to all the times her brother protected her and was honorable and fair to all the siblings. The Pope asked another question. "Do you swear to be a kind and fair king?" "I swear," Frederick replied. He would make a great king. Caterina was so proud of him. She smiled as she saw the crown get lowered onto Frederick's head, and the scepter was handed to him as well. Frederick turned around and was announced as the new king. The crowd cheered, and the king walked back down the aisle to the reception room where they would have the coronation party. In reality, they were just going to stand or sit around talking, eating, and drinking, since they were still in mourning. Caterina found her sister-in-law, and they started talking about how they would move into the king's chambers. "To be honest," said Natalia, "we have decided to give the Queen Mother another week in there, not only to move her things out, but also time to say goodbye to that part of her life. It's been hard on all of us, but harder on her." "I completely agree," Caterina nodded. "It's good that you are thinking of her. I heard one guest ask if we were going to put her away in a separate house now that Frederick is king. I nearly punched her." Natalia was furious on Lonnie's behalf, but giggled a little at Caterina's admission. People are going to butt into things that are not theirs to butt in. We just have to ignore them or politely disagree. "That's harder than it sounds." "It always is," Natalia replied. The new king, Frederick III, set about finalizing the marriage contract between his sister and Dmitri a few days later. Caterina was still doubtful that she would completely fall in love with Dmitri, not because he was a bad person, which he wasn't, but because she didn't know what real love was like. She had strong feelings for Dmitri, but what if that was all they were? She was afraid to marry him and then find out that she only had a small attraction for him. Caterina shared her fears with Frederick and Dmitri. Dmitri suggested, well, what about this? We add in a clause where, if we don't like each other anymore after we get married, then we can get divorced without repercussions of breaking a contract. Katerina toyed with that idea, but her brother agreed with Dmitri on it. As she thought about her brother's feelings about her and his advice to agree with the added clause for her own benefit, she finally decided to agree and go along with it. Then she asked, what about children? Will I be required to have a certain number of children, and if so, how many? Dmitri and Frederick were shocked. Dmitri exclaimed, you can have as many as you want, provided we have the one required to pass on the line. He told her about his parents' own arranged marriage and how they didn't specify how many kids they wanted. Frederick's own marriage contract didn't specify the number of children needed. He tried to calm his little sister. Katerina thought about it and then nodded to show that she understood and agreed to the fact that she only had to give birth to one heir. Good. Frederick added the clause of divorce to the marriage contract and then slid the contract over to the young couple. Please sign and it will be done. Dmitri read through the contract and signed his name at the end. Then he slid everything over to Katerina. Katerina looked at each of them. They seemed so honest about wanting this to work. She read over the entire contract. Everything seemed correct, so she signed her name at the end. Sighing, she slid it over to her brother. She took a deep breath and slowly let it out. She was officially engaged. She trembled slightly, knowing that her life was completely changed now. Katerina stood up. I'm going to walk around. She nodded to Frederick and Dmitri. Then she left the study. The two guys watched her leave, but could only shrug at each other. They didn't know how to react to that, so they didn't. Katerina walked around the castle, thinking about being engaged. She didn't realize that she was walking towards the dungeons until she stepped off the bottom step. Blinking, she looked around and saw a figure lying on a cot inside of a cell. The figure sat up as she approached. It was Eduardo. Katerina remembered that he was being held in here, but she hadn't expected him to be glaring at her. She really should have, though. Come to gloat? He asked, his dark eyes sending figurative knives at her. Katerina shook her head. I was just lost in thought. Oh, you should know that I'm engaged now. He screamed in frustration for the plan that had been in place. My grandfather will get me out of here, and you will become my bride. Wait, that old guy that wanted to kill my father is your grandfather? Huh, well, he came and then left, after I wounded him. As he stared at her in shock, she leaned forward with a sneer. He killed my father. It was the least I could do to repay him. She saw his shock morph into anger, and she backed away when he rushed forward. Hold it. You don't get to attack me. I'll kill you and your entire family for this. If my grandfather dies, you will wish you were never born, he screamed at her, not noticing that the silent guards around the room started walking towards him. He was glaring at Katerina. Well, that's a far cry from what you were saying before. Her voice shook slightly from the absolute venom in his voice. She backed up. Well, I think it's best that I leave. You are not getting out of here anytime soon. When we get around to it, you will be tried for your part of the battle. Her face was grave as she turned and left the dungeons. Katerina wandered around the castle some more and found herself in her mother's favorite sitting room. Would her mother keep this as her room? Would Natalia take it over? Katerina, came a voice to her right. It was Lonnie. Are you all right, my dear? Yes, mother, I'm fine. Just lost in thought, she said. Katerina saw that her mother was holding the new baby, the second princess. How's Adeline? She asked as she walked over. She's good, Lonnie smiled at her oldest daughter. Would you like to hold her? Katerina nervously nodded, and the 2-week-old baby was gently placed in her arms. She's so tiny, Katerina whispered in shock. She held her baby sister the way that she had always seen her mother hold her younger siblings, supporting the head with the inside of her elbow, wrapping her left arm around the small bundle, and holding the back and butt steady with her right forearm and hand. She looks like a doll. She looked at the tiny being in her arms, and Adeline looked back up at her. Hello, sweet Adeline. I'm your older sister. My name is Katerina. I'll take good care of you, I promise. Lonnie teared up as she smiled. Her baby girl was going to be so spoiled. She shared a glance with Natalia, and both grinned. Katerina paced around the room, staring at the sweet child in her arms. As she walked, Adeline's eyes started closing. Soon the baby was asleep, but Katerina kept walking around the room. She was just watching her baby sister sleep, so she didn't see the person that had just walked into the room. The person that had just walked in stopped suddenly and stared at her. He was staring at her with his mouth open. He didn't notice that the other 2 people in the room were smiling at him. When Katerina turned around and saw him, he shut his mouth and swallowed before saying, Hi. You look like you're comfortable. You're natural. She blushed. Thank you, Dmitri. She smiled and looked back at Adeline. She's adorable. He stepped closer. Yes, she is. He smiled down at the sleeping baby. She looks like you. The times are changing like leaves on a tree. I thought she looked more like Mother. Katerina looked back and forth between the baby in her arms and her mother. She could only see her mother in Adeline's face. Dmitri smiled again. Katerina, you look like your mother too. Katerina looked up at him in surprise. I do? I only thought that I had a few similarities to both my parents. No. You have a few similarities with your father, but you look a lot like your mom, Dmitri said. He smiled at her, staring deep into her eyes. She smiled back. Neither noticed that when Lonnie snatched up her sketchbook and a pencil. They were too wrapped up in each other. Lonnie had to sketch them in a way that she was able to draw the corner of Dimitri's mouth, which was curved up in a smile. Her drawing had them staring into each other's eyes and smiling over the baby. She labeled the drawing with each name and showed it to Natalia, who squealed slightly, but ultimately drew the attention of the young couple. Lonnie laughed and said, Come over here and see for yourselves. Katerina shared a confused look with Dmitri, and they walked over to sit near the others. Katerina handed over her little sister to her mother and took the drawing. Looking at it, she was shocked. The drawing showed love shining in her eyes and showed her how much they looked like a family. What? Dmitri was also looking at the drawing, and he looked at Katerina when he noticed the family vibe the drawing had. He smiled slightly. Lonnie smiled. You two looked so good together with Adeline, so I had to draw it. I thought it was wonderful. Do you not like it? Katerina handed the drawing back to her mother. I like it. I better go. She got up and hurried away. Everyone looked at each other in shock and confusion. What had just happened? No one knew, but in another part of the castle, the girl in question was hiding from everyone. What's going on? Does that drawing mean that I love him? Or is it only Mother's point of view? Katerina didn't know, and it was driving her crazy. Her mind kept bringing up the image of the drawing. She groaned and flopped face down onto her bed. She seriously needed to think about how she felt about Dmitri. She rolled over to look at the ceiling. How do I feel about him? I like him, obviously. But do I love him? I don't know. Do I really want to spend the rest of my life with him? I guess I just have only one thing to do. I have to talk to him. Katerina sat up and thought about the decision for a second before getting up from the bed and walking out of the room. He was still in the sitting room with her mother and sister-in-law when she walked in. They all looked at the doorway when she arrived. Dmitri, she paused. I will give this engagement a fighting chance now. After Katerina told Dmitri that she would give their engagement a shot, they were seen together more often. Sometimes they were walking around the village below the castle. Sometimes they were riding horses with an entourage, due to them only being engaged but not married yet. Sometimes they just sat in the sitting room or library with her family to supervise them. Frederick looked up from his papers. Then he smiled at the couple, seeing how close they were sitting, and went back to work. As he worked on seeing how the kingdom was doing, he asked them, So, how have your dates been going? Katerina blushed slightly and glanced at Dmitri. They've been going well. Dmitri took me to the bakery, on long rides on the castle grounds, over to the river where we started our journey. We had our portrait painted by a local artist, and he took me on a stroll around Mother's rose garden. You mean the rose garden where you had Dmitri pick one for your test? Frederick looked up at her with a grin. Katerina laughed in embarrassment. Yes, that one. Are there more than one? Dmitri asked, before wondering if that was a stupid question. No, there's just the one rose garden proper. But we do have roses in other areas as well for other purposes. The rose garden is her baby, but the other roses are the ones we give away to the villagers that might be hurt or sick. Katerina placed a hand on his. Don't worry. I didn't get into too much trouble for having you cut a rose off the bush. Every now and then, she'll cut some off. Okay, good. Dmitri laughed. He turned his hand over and held her hand gently. I wouldn't want to be called a rose killer, he joked. Frederick burst out laughing, reminding them that he was still there. When he saw that they were staring at him in shock, he asked, Did you really forget that I was here? Katerina's blush deepened. Maybe, she said, embarrassed. The trees swayed in the light breeze, the leaves fluttering on the limbs. Everyone turned to look out of the window at the golden brown foliage. Half of the branches at the top of one tree were bare, and as they watched, a leaf slowly detached and glided down to the ground. "I can't believe that it's fall already," Katerina observed, tilting her head as she looked out of the window. "I know," Dmitri replied. "It's happening so fast." "Yes, Frederick," said Frederick. He also enjoyed the sight, though. No one gave any thought to the prisoner in the dungeons below. If they had, they might have wondered why the guards were not coming out to switch shifts. They might have gone to investigate. However, they didn't, and no one thought to relieve the guards down there either. Frederick stood from his desk. "Let's go enjoy the weather in the inner courtyard. I can come back to this later." Katerina nodded. Yes, it should still be a nice day out, at least until later this year, or later in the year. Dmitri stood and offered his hand to Katerina. He smiled. He smiled when she took it, and when she stood, he offered his arm. Katerina placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, and they all walked through the halls to the inner courtyard, where the space was wide open and calming. There were several benches spread about, some under trees, and there was even a little pond with koi fish in it. "Isn't this place lovely, Dmitri?" she asked. "I love it," he replied. He looked at all of the many flowers. Some were climbing roses, some were gladiolus, and some were peonies. Some were bluebells, and others were marigolds. "It's so beautiful." Frederick smiled proudly. "My father had this courtyard decorated for mother. Before, it was just an empty courtyard." He continued to chaperone them while they sat in the courtyard, talking. It was nice to see the two getting along. He also thought about his future children. Would they find love? He liked to think so. Speaking of, he needed to make the announcement soon. Dmitri and Katerina were talking about future dates and even a few wedding plans, but decided that it was way too soon to think about wedding planning, especially when they had to deal with so much right now. Dmitri looked over at Frederick. "Your Majesty, should we head to dinner now?" It took a moment for Frederick to realize that Dmitri meant him, and then he replied, "Yes, we should. Also, I have an announcement for everyone." Katerina giggled. "Don't say a word," Frederick playfully glared at her. Then he led the two others inside into the dining hall. He paused for a minute at the king's chair, reminiscing about the man who used to sit there, before he walked over and sat down. The big announcement and a trial? Katerina sat down at the table, looking at everyone as they walked in and sat down, and said, "Okay, Frederick, we're all here. What's the big announcement?" "And that's my dryer. I'll leave it for now." He glared at her, inwardly laughing. "Okay, so Natalia and I have an announcement to make." He looked around at the curious faces and smiled. "We're expecting." There was pandemonium as everyone cheered at the news. Natalia blushed at the congratulations and replied, "Thank you. I'm about 4 months along." "Congrats, sis." Katerina said, hugging her sister-in-law. I wish you a safe and healthy pregnancy. Natalia was touched. She looked up at Frederick in wonder before looking back at Katerina with tears in her eyes. Thank you. As they ate, they also spoke about the new addition to the family. Everyone was excited about the idea of the family expanding. Katerina looked at Frederick. Brother, will we be having a party to celebrate the baby? Maybe at one point, he replied. First, we need to settle something. We need a trial. A trial? Asked Lonnie. She looked at her eldest in confusion. For Eduardo, Katerina stared at the table. She knew that it was probably long past time for his trial. When? She asked. Probably the day after tomorrow, Frederick frowned. Love, did you forget that you have to make the long journey around the country to show people their new king? Natalia smiled at her husband. Let's have the baby shower, and then we can go on the trip. We will handle the trial after that. We have way too much on our plates right now to worry about a trial. She didn't like suggesting that they put the trial off, but she felt that their people would get angry if they didn't start making their rounds. You're right, dear, Frederick said, smiling at Natalia. The dinner continued, and the family went to relax before bed. Katerina was in her room doing a reading when the cards gave her an ominous message. Something was going to happen, and it was going to be bad. She wrote about the reading in her journal and decided to tell her brother in the morning. Crawling into bed, she tried to meditate to get rid of the bad feeling, but it didn't work. Okay. That was just my cat. He's having a little trouble. Hiccups. All right, where was I? Ah, Lonnie spent the next day planning the baby shower for Natalia. She wanted this to be perfect for her daughter-in-law. She invited some village women and noble women to come and celebrate the new life coming to the royal family. Women in fine dresses came to give the new baby gifts of clothes in neutral colors, toys to learn with, and necessary items for the parents and maids to take care of the newborn with. Life was looking brighter already, with the amount of joy in it right now. In another part of the castle, a figure snuck through the halls, past immobile guards, into a secret passage. He pushed open the passageway and stepped inside. The door shut behind him automatically, and the passage grew dark. He moved through the hidden passage through memory of what he had been told and soon he was able to see a tiny bit of light at the end of the tunnel. He moved forward and saw a door outlined in light. Pressing on the door, he found himself inside the barn. He smirked. Then he snuck forward to his horse, who was staring at him. "Come on, boy. We're getting out of here." He saddled the horse and they walked out of the barn, down to the village, and then he rode his horse back toward his home. The morning after the baby shower, the royal family and Dmitri headed out with guards to travel the country. Frederick and Natalia led the family through the village below the castle, waving to the villagers and getting cheers in return. They continued on their way, going to the next village. The guards surrounded the family as they rode the few hours to the village where Katerina met the Lord and Lady Boiti. When they made it to the village, Frederick was greeted by the Lord and Lady and the rest of the village, except for his cousin, the Duchess. It made sense, since she was probably hiding away in mourning. He hadn't met her, because he didn't get out to the other villages, but he aimed to change that in the coming years. The villagers were a bit surprised to see Frederick instead of Julius, but no one complained. Then Frederick explained, As many of you can tell by my presence, my father is dead. He died last week in battle. I have taken my place as your new king, and I ask for your help in making this country stronger. We need to be united against any enemy, but not at the cost of being self-absorbed. It's a delicate balance, and I ask for you to set aside differences to help the country survive. Everyone was shocked to hear of King Julius's death, and they held a moment of silence while King Frederick spoke. By the end of the speech, many cheered at the thought of uniting the country completely, under the lead of their new king. Lord Boiti walked over to the royal family, but stayed far enough away that the guards wouldn't think him a threat, and said, My condolences for the death of King Julius. May he rest in peace. He bowed his head, and congratulations on your coronation, my king. Thank you, King Frederick replied graciously. That means a lot. He looked at Lady Boiti, who was watching them from the crowd. Please, invite Lady Boiti to join us. I know my sister would love to chat with her. Lord Boiti bowed to Frederick and turned to look at his wife. He waved her over, watching as she moved through the crowd to his side. My dear, the king wished to have you join us. Lady Boiti curtsied to Frederick. Thank you, your majesty. She looked up and saw a smile on his face. Then a voice came out of nowhere as a figure walked over to Lady Boiti. Lady Boiti, hello, how have you been? Katerina hugged the woman. The older woman smiled as she hugged the princess back. I am doing well, your highness. Our children came to visit us the other day. Apparently, we have a grandchild on the way. Oh? Lonnie asked, intrigued. She smiled at how welcome her daughter was. Maybe we can chat about our grandchildren one day. She glanced at Frederick, who nodded, and she turned back to Lady Boiti. Frederick has given me a grandchild as well. Lady Boiti looked at the king and his wife. Congratulations, your majesties. Thank you, Natalia said in her husband's place, as he was in the middle of talking with Lord Boiti. Lady Boiti smiled, turning back to Lonnie and Katerina. That would be wonderful, she said to Lonnie, not knowing how to address her. Lonnie smiled. This will take some getting used to, she replied. I guess you could call me the Queen Mother because I'm mother to the king. She smiled sadly. Bless me. Okay. Katerina smiled sadly as well. She still couldn't believe that her father was dead. Then she turned to Lady Watty. So, what plans do you have this winter, if you don't mind me asking? Natalia's baby is due in February. She smiled happily. I don't have many plans. I just plan on helping our village grow. Lady Watty looked into Katerina's eyes. The procession continues. Frederick called the rest of the royal family together. It was time to move to the next village. He didn't want to leave so soon, but they had 4 more villages to visit, and he didn't want to still be traveling when Natalia was 7 months pregnant. Frederick and his family waved to the villagers, letting them know that he appreciated them and that he was proud to be their king. Katerina followed her brothers, helping her mother into the carriage that was for the ladies. Katerina, Lonnie, Natalia, and the newborn Adeline were all comfortable, while the menfolk were riding in the cooling weather. She watched the scenery pass by as they turned north to head towards the next village. The lake whined slightly. He was getting cold. He tugged on George's shirt, getting his attention. I want to sit with Mummy. George nodded and turned back. He made it to the carriage, which stopped. When the door opened for them to see what was going on, he gently placed Blake in the carriage. He was cold, he said. He nodded to them and shut the door for them. Then he turned back around and rode back up to his place. Katerina smiled as Blake snuggled up to their mother. The carriage started moving again, and Katerina asked, May I hold Adeline so you can hold Blake? Bonnie smiled. Yes. She handed over the baby and pulled her youngest son into her lap. She held her son, letting him snuggle in, and rested her head on his. Katerina smiled down at the sleeping baby. She was such a good, quiet, and beautiful baby. Katerina just held the baby, and as the carriage rocked, she felt herself slowly fall asleep, holding the sleeping baby. Her head fell gently to the right to rest against the side of the carriage near the door. Adeline was supported with her head up on Katerina's chest on the left side. Natalia was reading, but when she looked up, she saw the 2 of them sleeping, and she smiled. She looked over at her mother-in-law and nudged her. When Lonnie looked over, Natalia motioned towards Katerina. Then the 2 women smiled at each other and settled down to relax. The carriage stopped hours later, and the door was opened. Pardon me. Dmitri looked inside the carriage and asked, Did you have a good ride back here? He smiled at Natalia, Lonnie, and Blake. When Natalia pointed over to the other side of the carriage, Dmitri looked over. He saw Katerina and Adeline still sleeping, and he grinned. They were so cute together. He helped the other 3 out of the carriage and climbed inside to pick Katerina up. He gently held her and Adeline so that he had a firm hold on his fiancée, while gently cushioning baby Adeline slightly between them. He carefully stepped out of the carriage, making sure that he didn't drop the 2 precious bundles in his arms. not seeing the smiles and nudges from Katerina's family. Frederick tried not to laugh out loud as Dmitri walked past him. He also noticed that the villagers were watching in intrigue at the young couple. They would stay in this village for a few days, letting the villagers see them interact. There was going to be a festival as well. He wanted the villagers to get to know him as their new king. Dmitri went over to a bench and sat down with Katerina in his lap. He made sure to keep supporting Adeline, and his hand brushed against Katerina's cheek. He wanted to slowly wake her up. He didn't want to startle her awake, so his fingers softly brushed her soft cheek. Katerina felt something tickle her cheek, and keeping hold of Adeline, she brushed at whatever was touching her cheek. Feeling another hand, she slowly opened her eyes, blinking at the evening light, and saw Dmitri's smiling face hovering above her. "What?" She sat up straight, holding on to Adeline, and looked at Dmitri. She was so confused. The last thing she remembered was holding Adeline in the carriage and smelling that baby smell of milk and powder. When did they get to the next village? She glanced around and saw her family members trying not to smile or laugh. She also saw the villagers watching. Katerina hopped up and stepped over to her mother. Her arms were trembling a little. "Here, let me take her. You can rest your arms then, and I'll change and feed her," Lonnie said, reaching over. Katerina slowly and carefully handed the now waking up baby over to her mother. When the transfer was complete, she carefully shook out her left arm, which was hurting the most. Looking up, she saw Frederick and George grinning. "Watch it, you two." Frederick and George raised their hands in surrender, laughing. Frederick said, "Sorry, but you looked so cute curled up in your fiancé's arms, asleep with the baby between you." Katerina blushed in embarrassment, and while Natalia got onto her husband, she glanced over at Dmitri, who was smiling in her direction. While Lonnie took care of Adeline, the others were shown the rooms they would have for the next few days. They were to rest for the night, but then there would be festivals. The festivals would go on day and night for the 5 days they would be there. When Katerina woke up the next morning, she got dressed and walked downstairs to the dining area of the inn. She noticed that Dmitri was already there and eating. "Good morning, Dmitri," she said happily as she sat down beside him. Dmitri swallowed the bite he had in his mouth and looked at her. "Good morning, Katerina. You look lovely this morning." She blushed. "Thank you." She saw a barmaid coming over to her, and when the girl got closer, Katerina asked, "Could I please have what he's having?" "Coffee and a plate of ham, eggs, and hash browns. Coming right up." The girl started to walk away, but Dmitri interjected. "Please bring creamer with her coffee," he said. The girl nodded and laughed, and Dmitri explained, "Creamer helps cut down on the bitter taste." "Oh," Katerina replied. "How did you come to get coffee?" Dmitri smiled. "One day this man appeared and said he had this drink that we had never heard of. He showed us how to brew coffee, and even brought what he told us was creamer that would help those that couldn't handle bitter drinks." "I see." Katerina looked around. As she waited for her food, they spoke about the procession so far, and what they hoped to accomplish on the rest of the trip. Her food arrived, and they just sat and talked while waiting for the others to get up. Katerina sipped at her coffee while it was black and shuddered. So she added some creamer and stirred it. Tasting it this time, she found that she liked the taste better now. She hummed and continued to drink. The taste was now smooth on her tongue and slid down her throat easily. "Do you like it?" Dmitri asked. Katerina nodded. "It's good." She went back to breaking her fast. All right, so that is the end of this reading. And ow, that hurt. Next time we will be reading about most of the festival days. So that's exciting. Also, I have to go check on my cat, see if he's doing okay. And of course, it's the fuzz butt. It's not the skinny little princess. All right. Also, next time, not only will we be working on or reading about most of the processions, we will get a closer view of how Dmitri and Katerina will get along on this journey. And then on Friday, we will be reading the last 3 chapters of the story. 3 or 4. So I hope you enjoyed today's reading. It was fun for me. Hopefully it was fun for you. I totally got tongue-tied on a lot of it. My stutter came back during it. And let's see. Yeah, it was fun. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break and then watch my friend's stream, and then I will try to write some more. I have about 9,000 more words until my goal for today. So, fun. All right, and I might do some sprinting in Discord, but we'll see. Thank you for hanging out with me. Leave a comment below if you want to guess what happens next. Hit the thumbs up if you like this video, and I shall see you Wednesday. All right, bye-bye.